Thank you very much. I get to talk about Brad a lot. It's one of my joys, one of my passions, but also I try not to harp on the mountaineering expertise and prowess of Brad Washburn. And for those of you who are familiar with Brad's work, you know well that Brad has a wide swath of expertise, interests, and accomplishments that include cartography, photography, mountaineering, exploration, museum administrator, educator. And so to try to capture Brad is difficult in a day and a half. It's much more difficult to do it in 15 or 20 minutes. So if you bear with me, we'll talk a little bit about Brad and some of his accomplishments and explorations in Wrangell, St. Elias, and also in Denali. This is a photo of Brad almost exactly 59 years ago, 1947, on the summit of Mount McKinley, a dashing young man of age 37. And this was his second ascent of Mount McKinley. However, Brad's explorations go way back. Oops. They go back to actually the creation, when there was a big bang. And just hit the black screen. Okay, so we're back from the Big Bang. We can move forward. Okay, we're there. Okay, great. Well, anyway, this is a photo. So 1947. This is a photo about 1923. Brad is 13 years old, and he began to enjoy the outdoors early age. His family is back to the Mayflower, Harvard educated, well off, so Brad was afforded some things other teenagers in the 20s weren't, and later on into the Depression. But early on, an affinity for the outdoors, and also what I have come to introduce him as when we've presented together as the ARE, Anal Retentive Explorer. This is Brad, and you'll notice the backpack is totally perfectly aligned. We have no sweat going on. He's perfectly coiffed. His buddies are in dire agony. This guy wants to go home. This guy's carrying the mail. I don't know what's happening here. And there's a box, and this kid wants to run. But this is classic Brad. You know, if you do it well. You're well prepared, and you'll see this later on in his work. He also, of course, along with the Anal Retentive Explorer, incredibly hand-drawn maps. And we see this in Brad's work throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s when he mapped Everest. You'll see these incredibly meticulous maps. This is Mount Washington, which he summited many, many times. Wrote a book on it in 1927. He wrote 3 books by the age of 21. I had a checkbook at age 21. But we see Brad, his evolution. People think he just began to explore Denali, which he's most known for, but in fact it goes back to his childhood and goes back to the Alps. Here's Brad, again looking at, looking like he is out for a Sunday walk. This is the Guy Verti, the first ascent of the North Face. They did it from their high camp to the summit, something like 4 hours and something minutes. This is Alfred Coutet and George Charlet, 2 incredibly wonderful, talented mountaineers. But this is 1929 at the age of 19. Again, at 19, I think I had my checkbook by then. So you see this incredible interest in the outdoors, cartography, meticulous detail, exploration of the Alps in 1929. The family was that well off that they could actually go overseas. And also this affinity for the use of the airplane and mountain photography. This is the Matterhorn, a beautiful photograph. And not just photography for photography's sake, but like his buddy Ansel Adams, the dramatic, the aesthetic. So not only is this wonderful for scientists and explorers and for mountaineers, but the aesthetic value of Brad's work, not only in the Alps, but dating back to that earlier photo, you see Brad with these small Kodak pocket vest cameras early on in his career in Mount Washington taking photographs. His photographic collection is in the tens of thousands, and we have many of those at Fairbanks. Some are back at Panopticon in Boston. His first trip to Alaska was in 1930. Tried to make the first ascent of Mount Fairweather. This is a group of buddies from Harvard. They're all looking actually very preppy. The style apparently is back with here, but here's Brad, styling with the tank top and muscular shirt, arms here. This is a 20-year-old, and his buddies are 20-year-old, from Boston. Brad cashed in an insurance policy. They got some money from Harvard, where they were all buddies, including Penrose bequest and Harvard Institute on Geographic Exploration. From Boston, an expedition planned all the way across the continent to Juneau by freighter up to Mount Fairweather. The exploration didn't go all that far. It was the first big disappointment in Brad's career, and I should note that at age 17, 18, 19, he was making ascents of Mount Blanc, the Matterhorn, Mount Rosa, the Aiguille Verte, so this was his first big disappointment, and it happened in Alaska. But what he did bring us, well, I will get this down. I promise you I'll get this down. What he did bring us was not only this interesting detailed map of the Tuya Bay to match with earlier explorers, but weather records. He brought back geologic samples, and he cut his teeth on the Alaskan mountains down in the Fairweather Range. In 31, he did some other things. I go back to the Alps, but in 1932, 33, and 34, this is where we see a very different Brad. This is the culmination of entrepreneur, selling articles based on expedition. Barker, he raised money selling photographs. Got the National Geographic involved in his work. He was able to raise money from family members. And we also see his reach out to the Harvard Committee on Geophysics, where he got money from the same folks who were funding Admiral Byrd to do scientific work in Antarctica, and understood early in his career that he had to have a science-related link to his work. That would be not only funding, but credibility and actually contribute to the scientific community. So 3 attempts on Mount Crillon in the Fairweather region. 1932 was a miserable time, but yet mapping, photography, geologic samples. 1933, they returned away just short of the summit, but mountaineering was important, but not the only thing. Finally, in 1934, the first ascent of Mount Crillon. Very dramatic. Gil Grosvenor bought the rights to this. They published it in National Geographic, and especially the summit photo of Ad Carter for those mountaineer fans. Here's Ad Carter in 1934. These guys are 24 years old. First ascent of Crillon. I talked to Ad years later about this. He said, it was wonderfully, wonderfully miserable. And you see it on Ad's face. Brad looks like he's going on a date. He is styling here. But this is classic Brad. Now, let me just, in threat of being cut off too soon, they only had Ad's small camera with them. They cached the cameras, some cameras below, and then Brad found when he got to the summit, his camera with the lens was a little loose. So they didn't get great photos of the summit. It torqued him off a lot, because one of the things he wanted to bring back was incredible details of everywhere he went. So they backed down the mountain to high camp, slept for about 3 or 4 hours, had hot cocoa and a marshmallow. He woke up the entire camp, and they went back up Crillon and climbed it twice so that Brad could get his photographs, the anal retentive explorer. God bless him for it. And you should see the follow-up photos of that. He looks even worse than... But in 1934, he also brought in with him not just the mountaineers, but the use of the airplane, the use of technology in Brad's work, all the way through the space shuttle that he used to help map Everest in the 80s. You see this wonderful use of technology throughout his time, including large format photos like this beautiful photo of Crillon Lake. They brought in I'm gonna get it. They brought in a canoe. They brought in a Victrola, so listen to opera at night when they were eating their dinner. And the plane brought it all in. They used the plane not only to drop off their stuff, but also to take aerial photographs. So the early use of aerial photographs, not just for aesthetic value or scientific value, but really to use it to weave their routes through the mountains, a trademark Washburn. And for the rest of his time, he used the planes to identify climbing routes and identify his path. Early on, he, with his friends at Harvard, he did some of the first early glacier movement surveys. So up here is a station where he put in concrete his wild T3 theodolite, and here is the sophisticated marker that they would trace. It had a little light bulb and a battery, and they would trace the movement of this sophisticated thing that sat on a box, and they would do hourly, bi-hourly readings of glacier movement. This is South Crillon Glacier. Brought that back, wrote it up into a scientific journal with Dick Goldthwait, with later on fame. So Brad, his use of the scientific field, and here's Dick down here, the first use of seismic surveys, dynamite in Alaska, to get a seismic profile underneath glaciers in Alaska. Brad brought that in as well. So my work wasn't just about mountaineering. I wanted to see the science and the way in which he conducted these field expeditions early in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So again, looking back at some of the work he did in 1930, we move ahead, and by 34, he honed his craft to bring us this. So 4 years later, we go from that to this beautiful, detailed map that he did along with Harvard and others of the Crillon region, which he surveyed aside from trying to climb the summit. So you see this evolution of explorer and entrepreneur all coming together. In 1935, he caught Gil Grosvenor's attention because of the Mount Crillon expedition, and Gil said to him, literally in the letters that Brad has given to me, hey kid, what do you want to do next? Well, you know, there are these big mountains in St. Elias, and I know you funded Israel Russell at the turn of the century, so go back there, use my big format cameras, and I will take aerial photographs of that entire area. Nobody's gone up and over that, and we'll see what we can find. Well, he and Bob Bates and others went across the continent in March of 1935, stopped in Carcross, got a big plane, shoved some dogs in them, dropped them off on the Lowell Glacier, which he named after President Lowell of Harvard, a great PR move. And they went up and over the Wrangell St. Elias by dog team 90 days. Brad and Andy Taylor came spitting out a Yakutat 90 days later. But what he did before then was take off by open cockpit plane from Carcross and fly over this entire region that nobody had seen way back in there. We knew the boundary peaks that had been surveyed, but Brad's aerial photography gave us the first detailed look within that range. And he discovered mountains like Mount Queen Mary and Mount King George. It just happened to be the Jubilee over in England. Might as well name it for them. Got nice telegrams from the Crown. Hey, Brad, well, you're a pretty good guy, Brad. So he's naming stuff after people, discovering him, and he's got a lot, to this day, that's the way Brad worked. Great explorer, great scientist, but he knew a PR angle when he saw it. So 5,000 square miles were mapped and surveyed as best as you could. He discovered this peak. This was called East Hubbard in 1935. Almost exactly 30 years later, in 1965, the Canadian government went to Brad and said, look, we want to name something in honor of President Kennedy. And he said, I found this hill that I think would work. And so the Canadian government changed the name from East Hubbard to Mount Kennedy. Mount Kennedy, named for John, Brad's buddy, who was one of his advisors at the Museum of Science. He had very good connections. And Brad, knowing that this would make much fanfare in Canada, pitched to Gil Grosvenor a survey of Mount Kennedy, which they funded generously. Mal Miller and others were on that expedition. Bobby Kennedy found out about it. I want to go climb Mount Kennedy. And the National Geographic said, well, we'll check with Brad. Brad said, no. I'm not going to take a guy who's never, but Bobby won. And so he left the capital and was planed across the continent, helicoptered into the base of Mount Kennedy, and was the first to summit Mount Kennedy in 1965, as Brad had helicopters and all sorts of surveyors going on around Mount Kennedy. Jim Whittaker took him all the way to the summit, where he buried John's inaugural speech and some cufflinks from PT 109. Took some photos, all back with the Kennedy family, the Kennedy coat of arms here. So Brad used this very well in National Geographic, lots of PR, and later on we have something to compare. Here's his map in 1935 of this general area, and in 1965 you get his map of the Mount Kennedy area. Swiss cartographers helped him do this. So again, the evolution, the technology, this incredible detail, that's the value that I see out of Brad's work, including the mountaineering, but this in particular, his use of the technology to be able to show us what the landscape looks like. Most people know him for, we've just transitioned now, most people know him for Denali, and that's absolutely a significant, his accomplishments on Denali are significant. My fascination with him is that the Southeast, I really didn't know a whole much about Brad's work there when I first started this work almost 20 years ago. But we know Brad from 3 summits of McKinley, 1942, 1947, 1951. For the mountaineers in the room, his West Buttress route that he did in 1951 is the way most of us have gone. This started as a compendium to the 1935 trip I just told you about, when he delivered to Gil Grosvenor not only Mount Crillon and Fairweather, but this incredible expedition in 1935. Grosvenor couldn't write a check quick enough. What else you want to do? Well, you know, I really would like to go fly over Mount McKinley and take some photos. Great. Gave him more money and sent the 26-year-old out now. And he got himself to Fairbanks, where he had the stylish mudlucks, the wooden stool here that you would sit on, his big giant format camera, his goofy hat, which now is in my daughter's room that he gave to her. And then you are, of course, you're hemp roped into the frame in case you are worried about falling out at 24,000 feet. So that's how he photographed Mount McKinley in 1936. And we have these spectacular photographs that many of us know so well from that expedition and many, many others. It was Brad's, how are we doing on time? I have 2 minutes. We'll get there. 2.5 minutes. Okay. In 1942, Brad was called along with Wilhelmer Stephenson, Sir Hubert Wilkin, Leon Bean, L.L. Bean, which I've given a lot of money to, and others to become consultants to the U.S. military. We're in a global war, Cold War and cold weather research needs to be done. The U.S. was not prepared, and so Washburn, along with others, helped the military, ground troops, and Air Force to design clothing, and they used Mount McKinley as the staging ground from Fairbanks. Real-time use of equipment that was in process at Wright Field, and literally these guys climbed the mountain and would wire back. The eyelet doesn't work, the collar's too big, the tent's too, and that would make its way all the way back to Wright Field for adjustments in this machine to try to get our troops prepared for an incredible war. One story, what the military had were these giant mittens that most of the troops used in Alaska and other places. Our flyers, which is what Brad was most concerned about, would have to take those off at 16,000 feet as they were gunning because they couldn't work the guns with these giant mittens. And so our guys, especially over Europe, the rate of frostbite was hellacious. You can almost expect that if you're on a bombing run, you would get either frostbite on your hands or your feet because there were metal plates they were standing on, and insulation in the boots just wasn't working. So this is real-time save the troops, and this is real-time expedition. This is the third ascent of McKinley. You'll notice that if you have Bean boots, LL made lots of dough. They're outfitted with LL Bean boots. And there's Brad styling his idea of this shearling suit for high-altitude bombers. The problem here was to balance standing still fighting, and then if you're shot down, how do you balance that in the field when you're running from or fighting an enemy? And so they were worried about frostbite and freezing at night, those sorts of things. In 1947, as the summit of McKinley, Brad surveyed from the summit of Mount McKinley. He had this affinity for the mountain and wanted to survey it, and spent almost 15 years working on surveying Mount McKinley. He got money from the military. He got money from Office of Naval Research because the military was interested in cosmic ray research. They wanted to shoot rockets through the atmosphere and bomb somebody. They had to know about many things, including cosmic ray. Brad said, hey, I got an idea. Go to Office of Naval Research, get some dough from them, go to my military guys, they'll fly me in. I'll get money from Harvard that will help us do the research along with the University of Chicago, and he mounted what became Operation White Tower. And since RKO Pictures bought the rights to James Ullman Ramsey's, what does that mean to me?
Oh, I mean, you can finish up. Just
okay, I thought I said something wrong.
Yeah.
No.
It'll be a minute or two.
Being censored.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Not the first time. Because RKO Pictures bought the right to own to Ramsey's book entitled The White Tower. They wanted Brad to go on an expedition and film a crew that they could use in an RKO Pictures Hollywood picture of this incredible book of a fictional climb. So they funded Brad, and he would go to, he'd say, sure, RKO, I'll take your money because I want to go survey the mountain. And then he'd go to Harvard and say, you know, these guys from RKO, they're twisting my arm. I got to figure out an angle. Give me an angle. How about cosmic ray research? It works, okay. Then he'd go to the military and say, hey, I don't know, but those crazy wackos at RKO and Harvard, they want me to do this thing. Can I have a few planes? Sure. Oh, great. And he was able to work all the angles, and I say that with respect and love, that he knew how to get everybody together to mount the expedition that he wanted. And since the book featured a romance, you need a lady for that romance, why not bring Barbara? And so they filmed Barbara on the mountain. That's in 1947, where she became the first woman to climb Mount McKinley. Oh, let me back up. Just one thought. As they were leaving Denali Pass to head up, they got a radio call that RKO Pictures had a great marketing twist. They wanted to drop to Brad by parachute at 18.2 a life-size cutout of Rita Hayworth. And Rita would go right about there. Brad turned it down later on because even Brad had a limit. And later on they found Rita in a hangar in Anchorage with many GIs eyeing it for a long time and then mysteriously disappeared sometime along the way. Anyway, but survey from the summit of McKinley to try to get a real accurate survey and map of Denali. So he used many to do that. And then, as many of you know, the West Buttress route pioneered in '51, but spied in 1936 when he did the aerial surveys, and also in '42 and '47 when he stood on the summit and spied this route. Through the 50s, continued surveys of the Denali region, And when Brad was climbing in 42, this is what was known of the basic region. We had these sorts of maps. In fact, he used these in 47 and in 51. What Brad gave to us was a map that many of you know, and I did it in black and white for a reason. This detail, again with the Swiss, released in 1960, really today is the definitive map of McKinley. It's in color, but you use it for many things like armchair explorers and historians. This happens to be the route of the Sourdough expedition of 1910. But so amounts, in addition to 3 ascents of McKinley and all the other work, Brad again, the cartographer and the mountaineer and the photographer. Well, where does Brad sit? Because now I'm done. So you see the evolution of a young boy in the White Mountains, maps, mountaineering, science angles, aerial photography, aesthetics. You see the evolution of his maps, persistence, and of course always the anal retentive explorer. A lot of my work was and still is on his work as a scientist and contribution to American field science. And so where does he sit here? So in the late 80s, National Geographic, I thought I'd get it down too. I thought I had it. National Geographic through Gil Grosvenor had their centennial celebration where they picked the surviving sort of creme de la creme of their living explorers, those who they've had relationships with, and much discussion about who those might be. So where did Washburn sit? Well, dang it. Okay, there you have it. So here's Ed Hillary, and Richard Leakey, and John Glenn, and Bob Ballard, and Jacques Cousteau, Jane Goodall, and Barbara and Brad Washburn. So above and beyond the photographs and the cartography and 41 years as a Museum of Science administrator, on and on and on, that's his peer group, not just the mountaineer, the explorer, and the scientist. Okay. Thank you for your time.